Picture this. It is March 17th, 732 AD, and you are a Frankish foot soldier standing in a frozen field somewhere between the towns of Tours and Poitiers. Your hands are numb. Your breath comes out in white clouds. You have been marching for days through the mud and sleet of early spring, and now you are standing in a shield wall, shoulder to shoulder with men who smell like wet leather and fear. In front of you, stretching as far as your eyes can see, is the largest army you have ever witnessed in your life. 30,000 warriors, maybe more. The banners of the Umayyad Caliphate snap in the cold wind, green silk embroidered with gold Arabic script that you cannot read but that you know means conquest. These are the men who have conquered everything from the deserts of Arabia to the gardens of Damascus. They have crushed the Persians, swallowed North Africa, and turned Spain into a province of Islam in less than 20 years. They have never lost. Not once. And now they are here, in the heart of Christian Europe, looking at you like you are the last obstacle between them and total domination of the West. Your commander is a man named Charles. He does not have a fancy title yet. History will later call him Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, but right now he is just a bastard son who sees power through violence and cunning. He is not a king. He is not even supposed to be in charge. But he is the only man in Francia with the spine to stand between civilization and the abyss. He has given you a simple order: hold the line. Do not move. Do not charge. Just stand there and take whatever hell the enemy throws at you. It sounds like suicide. It feels like suicide. But Charles has a plan that defies every rule of medieval warfare. He is going to turn your fear, your exhaustion, and your desperation into the deadliest weapon on the battlefield. And if it works, you will save Europe. If it fails, Christianity will drown in a tide of Islamic conquest that will never stop. The fate of Western civilization is balanced on the edge of your shield. This is not just a battle. This is the moment where the future of the world will be decided by cold steel, discipline, and one man's refusal to run. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand why you should be terrified standing in that field, you have to understand what is coming toward you. The Umayyad army is not just a military force. It is a juggernaut that has been rolling across the known world for 100 years without stopping. These are the same warriors who shattered the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Yarmouk. These are the men who destroyed the Visigoth kingdom of Spain in a single afternoon. They fight with a speed and ferocity that makes European armies look like they are moving in slow motion. At the heart of this terrifying machine is the Berber and Arab cavalry. These are not the heavy knights that Europe will develop centuries later. These are light horsemen, fast and deadly, riding horses bred for endurance in the desert. They wear leather and mail, not the crushing weight of full plate armor. Their primary weapons are the composite bow, the curved saber, and the lance. But their real weapon is mobility. They can ride circles around European infantry. They can loose arrows while galloping at full speed. They hit you from an angle you did not expect, then vanish before you can counterattack. The commander of this unstoppable force is a man named Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi. He is the governor of Al-Andalus, what we now call Spain, and he is one of the most experienced military minds in the Islamic world. He has spent years fighting in the Pyrenees, raiding into southern Francia, testing the defenses, probing for weakness. He knows the Franks are disorganized. He knows their nobility is fractured by civil war. He knows they have no standing army, just levies of farmers called up when danger appears. To Abdul Rahman, this is not an invasion. It is a mopping up operation. The hard work was done in Spain. Francia is just the next domino to fall. And after Francia, Italy, Rome itself. The heart of Christendom is within reach, and nothing stands in the way except a bastard warlord and a collection of exhausted peasants freezing in a field. But here is what Abdul Rahman does not know. He does not know that the man facing him is not like the other Frankish leaders. Charles is not a nobleman playing at war. He is a survivor who has clawed his way to power through a lifetime of violence. He has studied every defeat the Franks have suffered. He has learned from the mistakes of the Visigoths in Spain. He knows that if he tries to fight the Umayyads the old way, with disorganized charges and loose formations, he will be slaughtered. So he has done something radical. He has trained his men to do nothing, to stand still, to absorb punishment and wait. It sounds insane, but Charles understands something fundamental about warfare. Sometimes the best defense is an unbreakable defense. He is betting everything that the Umayyad cavalry will shatter themselves against his shield wall, like waves against a cliff. He is counting on their impatience, their arrogance, their certainty that one more charge will break these pathetic Christians. And when they are exhausted, when their horses are blown, and their formations are scattered, that is when Charles will unleash hell. The stage is set for one of the most important battles in human history. On one side, the greatest military power on earth, flush with a century of unbroken victories. On the other, a desperate collection of Frankish farmers and minor nobility, led by a man who is not even supposed to be in charge. The experts give Charles no chance. The chroniclers assume the battle is already lost before it begins. But they are all looking at the wrong numbers. They are counting soldiers and horses. Charles is counting hours. He knows that if he can make this battle last longer than a single cavalry charge, if he can turn it into a grinding war of attrition, then time becomes his ally. Every hour that passes is an hour the Umayyad horses are not resting. Every minute of combat is a minute their supply lines are stretched thinner. Charles does not need to destroy the enemy. He just needs to make them bleed slowly enough that they decide the prize is not worth the cost. But standing in that field, watching 30,000 warriors prepare to charge, you do not know any of this. You just know that the drumming has started, the ground is beginning to shake. And Charles has given the order that will either save you or doom you. Hold the line. To understand how desperate this moment truly is, we need to go back 14 years. We need to understand how the most powerful empire on earth ended up in the middle of France, and how a bastard with no legitimate claim to power became the only man capable of stopping them. The story begins not with Charles, but with the collapse of everything he knew. In the early 700s, the Frankish kingdom was tearing itself apart. This was not a unified nation. It was a patchwork of rival nobles, each controlling their own territories, each plotting against the others. The Merovingian dynasty, which had ruled the Franks since the fall of Rome, had become a joke. The kings were figureheads, puppet monarchs controlled by their palace mayors. Real power lay with the mayor of the palace, the man who controlled the royal household and the army. And in the year 714, that position was held by a man named Pepin of Herstal. Pepin was Charles's father, and he was a political genius. He had spent decades consolidating power, playing the Merovingian kings like puppets while quietly building his own base of support. When Pepin died in 714, he should have passed his position to his legitimate son, Grimoald. But Grimoald was murdered within months, stabbed to death in a church by assassins who were never caught. The murder created a power vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped Pepin's widow, Plectrude. She was determined to hold on to power for her infant grandson, but she made a fatal mistake. She ignored Charles. Charles was Pepin's oldest son, but he was illegitimate, born to a concubine named Alpida. In the eyes of the Frankish nobility, he was a bastard with no rights, no claim, no future. Plectrude had him arrested and thrown into prison. She thought she had neutralized the threat. She was wrong. Charles escaped. We do not know how. The chronicles are frustratingly vague on the details. But sometime in 715, Charles broke out of captivity and disappeared into the wilderness. He did not run away. He began gathering followers, discontented nobles, landless warriors, anyone who saw opportunity in the chaos. He was not fighting for legitimacy or honor. He was fighting for survival, and that made him dangerous. While Plectrude tried to rule through the fiction of the infant king, Charles was building a real army. The Frankish kingdom descended into civil war. Neustria, the western part of the kingdom, rebelled against Plectrude's rule. They saw weakness and moved to exploit it. Charles saw opportunity. He allied with whichever side would give him power, switching loyalties when it suited him, crushing anyone who stood in his way. This was not the chivalric warfare of later centuries. This was brutal, pragmatic violence. Charles was learning the most important lesson of his life. Sentimentality gets you killed. By 717, Charles had effectively seized control of Austrasia, the eastern heartland of the Frankish kingdom. He was not mayor of the palace yet. He was not even officially recognized. But he had the army, and in the chaos of the early Middle Ages, the man with the army is the man in charge. He spent the next decade fighting rebellions, crushing rivals, and slowly stitching the fractured kingdom back together through sheer force of will. He was not loved, he was feared, and fear, as Charles understood, was more reliable than love. But while Charles was busy consolidating power in the north, something far more dangerous was brewing in the south. In 711, the same year Pepin of Herstal died, a Muslim army crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and invaded Spain. The conquest was so fast and so complete that it seemed like divine intervention. The Visigoth kingdom collapsed in weeks. By 720, the Umayyad Caliphate controlled everything south of the Pyrenees, and they were not stopping. The momentum of conquest is a powerful drug. The Umayyad commanders looked at the mountains separating Spain from France and saw not a barrier, but a gateway. They began launching raids across the Pyrenees, testing the defenses, gathering intelligence, taking plunder. The Frankish nobles in the south were paralyzed. They could not organize a defense because they did not trust each other. They sent desperate messages to Charles, begging for help. But Charles was still fighting his own wars. He could not march south until he had secured his grip on the north. It was a race against time, and for years it looked like time was running out. The raids grew bolder. Entire towns were sacked. Monasteries were burned. The Umayyad cavalry rode deeper into Aquitaine, the rich southwestern region of Francia, and faced almost no resistance. The local duke, a man named Odo, tried to stand against them. He was brave and he was competent, but he was hopelessly outmatched. In 732, Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi assembled the largest invasion force yet seen north of the Pyrenees. This was not a raid. This was a conquest. He marched out of Spain with an army that chroniclers claimed numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Modern historians suggest a more realistic figure of 30 to 40,000, but even that was massive by the standards of the time. Odo of Aquitaine tried to stop them at the Battle of Bordeaux. He was crushed. His army was scattered. He fled north with the survivors, desperate and humiliated, and did the one thing he had sworn never to do. He went to Charles and begged for help. Charles was not a forgiving man. Odo had rebelled against him years earlier. Charles could have let him twist in the wind. He could have watched Aquitaine burn and then picked up the pieces afterward. But Charles understood something that Odo did not. If the Umayyads were allowed to consolidate their hold on Aquitaine, they would be unstoppable. They would have a base of operations in the heart of Francia. They could strike north whenever they wanted. This was not Odo's problem. This was everyone's problem. Charles agreed to help, but his price was steep. Odo would submit to his authority. Aquitaine would acknowledge Charles as overlord. Odo, with no other options, agreed. For Charles, this was not about saving Christendom. It was about power. If he defeated the Umayyads, he would be the savior of Francia. His legitimacy would be unquestionable. The bastard would become the hero. But first, he had to win a battle against an enemy that had never lost. Charles mobilized every man he could find. He called up the levies from across the kingdom. He stripped the garrisons from the northern borders. He took a massive gamble, leaving his rear exposed to potential rebellion, betting everything on one decisive engagement. He did not have time to train a professional army. He did not have the resources to outfit heavy cavalry. What he had was infantry, lots of infantry, Frankish freemen who knew how to hold a shield and thrust a spear. They were not elite troops, but they were solid, dependable, and most importantly, they would follow orders. Charles drilled them relentlessly on the march south. He taught them one formation: the shield wall. Lock shields. Stand firm. Do not break. It was not complicated, but it did not need to be. Complexity is the enemy of discipline. Simple tactics executed perfectly beat complicated tactics executed poorly every single time. As Charles marched south, scouts brought him reports of the Umayyad advance. Abdul Rahman was moving slowly, weighed down by an enormous baggage train. The Muslim army had spent weeks plundering Aquitaine. They were loaded with treasure, gold from churches, silver from monasteries, silk and jewels from the villas of Roman aristocrats. They were so confident in their victory that they were already dividing the spoils. Charles saw opportunity in that greed. An army burdened with loot is an army that cannot move quickly. An army protecting treasure is an army that will hesitate to take risks. He needed to force Abdul Rahman into a battle before the Muslims could consolidate their position or retreat back to Spain with their plunder intact. Charles chose his battlefield carefully. Somewhere between the cities of Tours and Poitiers, the exact location lost to history, he found a stretch of open ground bordered by thick forests. It was not ideal terrain for cavalry. The ground was soft from recent rains. There was no room for wide flanking maneuvers. It was a choke point, and Charles planted himself right in the middle of it. He formed his army into a massive square, a human fortress bristling with spears and shields. The Franks were arranged in deep ranks, maybe 8 to 10 men deep in some places, creating a wall of bodies that would be almost impossible to break through. Charles put his best troops in the front, veterans who had fought in his civil wars, men who knew how to hold a line under pressure. Behind them were the levies, farmers, and townsmen who had been handed weapons and told to stand firm. And in the very center, surrounded by his household guard, stood Charles himself. He was not hiding in the rear. He was not directing the battle from a distant hill. He was in the fight, visible to every man in his army, a constant reminder that their commander would live or die with them. When the Umayyad scouts reported the Frankish position, Abdul Rahman must have been surprised. The Christians were not running. They were not hiding behind city walls. They were standing in the open, waiting for him. It looked like arrogance or stupidity. Either way, it was an invitation Abdul Rahman could not refuse. He had been raiding Francia for weeks without facing serious resistance. One more battle would finish this campaign. He would crush these Franks, take the plunder back to Spain, and return next year to finish the conquest. The psychology of the moment was critical. Abdul Rahman had momentum. His men were flush with success. They believed God was on their side, that they were destined to conquer the world just as they had conquered everything else. They looked at the Frankish shield wall and saw an obstacle, but not a threat. They had broken shield walls before. They would break this one too. But Charles was counting on that confidence. He was counting on them to charge. Because once they committed to the attack, once their cavalry was tangled up in his formation, the mobility advantage that made them so dangerous would evaporate. They would be stuck in a grinding melee, exactly where the Franks were strongest. The night before the battle, Charles walked through his camp. He did not give a speech. There was no soaring rhetoric about God and glory. He simply reminded his men of what was at stake. If they lost, their homes would burn. Their families would be enslaved or killed. Everything they knew would be erased. But if they held, if they stood firm for just one day, they would break the back of the invasion. The Umayyads would retreat. Francia would be saved. It was not inspiring in the traditional sense. It was terrifying. But terror, properly channeled, is a powerful motivator. As dawn broke on October 10th, 732, the two armies faced each other across the muddy field. The Umayyad cavalry formed up in great blocks, thousands of horsemen arranged in waves. They did not attack immediately. They waited, letting the tension build, letting the Franks stare at the overwhelming force arrayed against them. It was psychological warfare. The longer the Franks stood there, looking at that wall of warriors, the more their fear would grow. Some men would break before the first blow was struck, or so the Umayyads thought. But Charles had prepared his men for this moment. They knew the enemy would try to intimidate them. They knew the waiting was part of the attack. So they stood, silent, unmoving, a wall of iron and wood and grim determination. The Umayyad drums began to beat. The rhythm was slow at first, then faster, building to a thunderous crescendo. The cavalry started to move. Thousands of horses walked forward, then trotted, then broke into a gallop. The ground shook. The sound was like an earthquake, a rolling thunder that drowned out all thought. This was the moment where most armies would panic. This was where the formation would break and men would run. But the Franks did not run. They locked their shields tighter, they lowered their spears, and they waited for impact. When the first wave of Umayyad cavalry hit the Frankish line, the collision was catastrophic. Horses slammed into the wall of shields at full speed. Spears punched through leather armor and into flesh. Men screamed. Horses screamed. The front rank of the Frankish formation was compressed backward by the sheer kinetic energy of the charge, but it did not break. The second rank pushed forward, stabilizing the line. The third rank thrust spears over the shoulders of the men in front, creating a hedge of steel that no horse would willingly enter. This was not the elegant warfare of later centuries. This was butchery, close, intimate, brutal violence where you could smell the breath of the man you were trying to kill. The Umayyad cavalry tried to break through using sheer force. They wheeled around and charged again, and again. Each time, the Frankish line buckled but held. Each time, more horses died, impaled on Frankish spears. Each time, more riders were pulled from their saddles and killed on the ground. The Franks were taking horrific casualties. Men in the front rank were being cut down by saber strikes, crushed by falling horses, trampled in the chaos. But every time a man fell, another stepped forward to take his place. The formation was a living organism, constantly regenerating, absorbing damage, and continuing to function. This was Charles's genius. He had created a system where individual heroism did not matter. What mattered was the collective discipline of the formation. As long as the line held, the Franks could not lose. As the morning wore on, the Umayyad cavalry began to slow. Their horses were exhausted. You cannot charge heavy cavalry into an infantry formation over and over without paying a terrible price. The animals were bleeding, foaming, dying. The riders were frustrated and confused. This was not how battles were supposed to go. They were supposed to break the enemy formation with the first charge, maybe the second. But these Franks were not breaking. They were just standing there, absorbing punishment, killing horses, and refusing to die. Abdul Rahman must have been watching from his command position with growing concern. He had committed his cavalry, his best troops, his primary weapon, and they were accomplishing nothing. Worse, they were being ground down. Every hour of this battle was an hour his advantage was slipping away. But he could not retreat. Not yet. Not without delivering a decisive blow. Retreating now would be an admission of failure. It would shatter the aura of invincibility that the Umayyad armies carried with them. So he committed his reserves. He threw everything he had at the Frankish line, wave after wave of horsemen, trying to find a weak point, trying to create a breach that could be exploited. It was a war of attrition now, and Charles had been planning for exactly this. While the Umayyad cavalry exhausted themselves against the shield wall, Charles kept a portion of his army in reserve. He had not committed everyone to the front line. He had held back units on the flanks, hidden in the tree line, waiting for the perfect moment. He was not just defending, he was setting a trap, and Abdul Rahman, fixated on breaking the Frankish center, did not see it closing around him. As the afternoon sun began to descend, something strange happened. The Umayyad cavalry charges grew less frequent. The pauses between attacks grew longer. The horses needed rest. The men needed water. The formation was starting to fray at the edges. And that is when Charles made his move. He did not order a general advance. He did not throw his entire army forward in a wild charge. That would have been suicide. Instead, he sent small units of infantry forward from the flanks, moving through the trees, aiming not for the enemy cavalry, but for something far more valuable: the baggage train. The Umayyad camp was behind their battle line, guarded but not heavily defended. Most of the warriors were at the front, engaged in the fighting. The treasure, the plunder from weeks of raiding, was sitting in carts and tents, protected by a skeleton crew of guards and servants. When the first Frankish units hit the camp, panic erupted. The guards tried to fight back, but they were overwhelmed. The Franks did not stop to loot. They set everything on fire. Tents went up in flames. Carts were overturned. The smoke was visible across the battlefield. And when the Umayyad cavalry saw the smoke rising from their camp, something inside them broke. They were not just fighting for conquest anymore. They were fighting for their lives and their fortunes. The plunder they had spent weeks gathering was burning. Worse, their families were back there. Many of the Umayyad soldiers had brought their wives, their children, their servants with them on this campaign. The camp was not just a supply depot. It was a city of dependence, and it was under attack. The discipline of the Umayyad army shattered in an instant. Units began to peel away from the front line, riders turning their horses and galloping back toward the camp. Officers screamed orders to hold position, but the panic was contagious. More and more warriors broke off, desperate to save what was theirs. The coordinated assault on the Frankish line disintegrated into chaos. Charles saw the enemy formation falling apart and gave the order his men had been waiting for all day: advance. The Frankish shield wall, which had stood immobile for hours, began to move forward, slowly at first, then faster. They were not charging wildly. They were moving as a unit, maintaining formation, pushing the disorganized Umayyad forces back. This was the moment where the battle turned from defense to annihilation. The Umayyad cavalry, caught between the advancing Franks and the chaos at their camp, lost all cohesion. Some tried to fight, some tried to flee, most just died. The Franks, who had been absorbing punishment all day, unleashed all their pent-up rage and fear. They did not take prisoners. They did not offer quarter. This was extermination. As the sun set on October 10th, 732, the battlefield was a nightmare. Bodies of men and horses carpeted the ground. The air was thick with smoke from the burning camp. The screams of the wounded echoed across the field. The Umayyad army, the unstoppable force that had conquered half the world, had been shattered. Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the brilliant commander who had led them to victory after victory, was dead. He had been killed in the chaos, cut down while trying to rally his men. His body would not be found for days. With their commander dead and their camp destroyed, The surviving Umayyad forces fled south under cover of darkness. They did not stop to regroup. They did not try to hold any ground. They ran all the way back to Spain, leaving their dead, their wounded, and their treasure behind. When dawn broke on October 11th, Charles and his men stood amidst the wreckage. They had won, but the cost had been horrific. Thousands of Franks lay dead or dying on the field. The survivors were exhausted, traumatized, barely able to stand, but they had held. They had done the impossible. They had stopped an empire. Charles did not celebrate. He did not chase the fleeing enemy. He knew his army was in no condition to pursue. He ordered his men to secure the battlefield, tend to the wounded, and bury the dead. He posted guards to watch the southern roads in case the Umayyads regrouped and came back. But he knew they would not. Not this year. Maybe not ever. The myth of Umayyad invincibility had been shattered. The word would spread across Europe and across the Islamic world. The Franks had stood. The Franks had won. Christianity had survived. The immediate aftermath of the battle was chaos. The Frankish army, exhausted and bloodied, did not have the strength to pursue the fleeing Umayyads. Charles ordered his men to strip the dead of weapons and armor, to collect the plunder the enemy had abandoned, and to fortify their position in case of a counterattack. But no counterattack came. The Umayyad survivors were too terrified, too disorganized, too broken to even think about returning. They fled south in scattered groups, abandoning their wounded, leaving behind a trail of discarded equipment and dead horses. The retreat turned into a rout. Many died on the road back to Spain, killed by cold, hunger, or attacks from local militias who saw an opportunity for revenge. By the time the remnants of Abdul Rahman's army staggered back across the Pyrenees, they had lost not just a battle, but an entire generation of warriors. The impact on the Umayyad Caliphate was profound. Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi had been one of their most capable commanders, a man who understood European warfare and knew how to exploit Frankish weaknesses. His death left a leadership vacuum that would not be easily filled. But more than that, his defeat shattered the psychological momentum of Islamic expansion into Europe. For a century, the Umayyads had been expanding in every direction. They conquered with such speed and efficiency that it seemed like divine favor. Every battle reinforced the belief that God was on their side, that they were destined to bring the entire world under Islamic rule. Tours broke that narrative. It proved that the expansion could be stopped. It showed that Christian armies, properly led and properly organized, could stand against the Caliphate. The defeat had ripple effects across the Islamic world. In Al-Andalus, the Umayyad province in Spain, governors became more cautious. They stopped launching major invasions into Francia and focused instead on consolidating their hold on the Iberian Peninsula. Raids across the Pyrenees continued for decades, but they were smaller, more opportunistic, lacking the grand strategic vision that had driven Abdul Rahman. The northern border of Islamic expansion had been drawn not by mountains or rivers, but by Frankish shields and Frankish blood. The battle did not end Islamic presence in Europe. The Umayyads would rule Spain for another 700 years. But it ended the dream of conquering Francia, of pushing through to Italy and Rome, of erasing Christianity from the European continent. For Charles, the victory at Tours was the defining moment of his life. Before the battle, he was a usurper, a bastard who had clawed his way to power through violence and treachery. After the battle, he was the savior of Christendom. The Pope sent him letters of congratulation. Monasteries composed prayers in his honor. Common people began calling him Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, the man who had struck the blow that saved Europe. The legitimacy he had been fighting for his entire life was handed to him on the battlefield. But Charles was not done. He understood that Tours had bought time, not permanent security. The Umayyads might be broken for now, but they could regroup. They could return. And even if they did not, there were other threats. The Saxons to the north were still pagan and still raiding Frankish territory. The various Frankish nobles, always ready to rebel, needed to be kept in line. Charles spent the next decade consolidating his power, crushing rebellions, and preparing for the next crisis. He never called himself king. He continued to rule through the fiction of the Merovingian puppet monarchs, but everyone knew where the real power lay. He built the foundation for a dynasty that would rule Francia for generations. His son, Pepin the Short, would eventually discard the pretense and crown himself king. His grandson would go even further. That grandson was Charlemagne, Charles the Great, who would build the largest empire in Western Europe since Rome. But none of that would have been possible without Tours. If Charles had lost that battle, there would have been no Carolingian dynasty. there would have been no Frankish Empire. The history of Europe would have taken a radically different path. To understand just how different, we need to play the what-if game. What if Abdul Rahman had won at Tours? What if the Umayyad cavalry had broken the Frankish line? What if Charles had panicked and ordered a retreat? The Umayyads would have consolidated their hold on Aquitaine. They would have used it as a base to launch further invasions into the heart of Francia. The Frankish kingdom, already fractured by civil war, would likely have collapsed. Some nobles would have resisted. Some would have converted to Islam or paid tribute to avoid destruction. But without a strong central authority, without a leader like Charles to unite them, the Franks would have been picked apart piece by piece. From Francia, the road to Italy was wide open. The Italian peninsula was even more divided than Francia, a patchwork of rival cities and minor kingdoms. The Lombards in the north, the Byzantine holdings in the south, the Papal States in the center, all were too weak to resist a determined Umayyad invasion. Rome, the spiritual heart of Christianity, would have fallen. The Pope would have been forced to flee or submit. The psychological impact of losing Rome cannot be overstated. For Christians across Europe, Rome was not just a city. It was a symbol, the link to St. Peter, the foundation of the Church. Its fall would have shattered Christian morale. Many would have seen it as proof that God had abandoned them, that Islam was the true faith. Mass conversions would have followed. And once Italy fell, what was left? Germany was a collection of pagan tribes, disorganized and primitive. They would have been easy prey. The Byzantine Empire, already weakened by centuries of war with Persia and the first wave of Islamic conquests, would have been surrounded and eventually strangled. Within a few generations, all of Europe could have become part of the Islamic world. The cultural implications are staggering. There would have been no Charlemagne to revive learning in the West. There would have been no Holy Roman Empire to provide a counterweight to Islamic power. The Crusades would never have happened because there would have been no Christian states powerful enough to launch them. The Renaissance, born in the cities of Italy, would never have occurred, at least not in the form we know. Universities, Gothic cathedrals, the scientific revolution, the Reformation, all the developments that shaped Western civilization might never have emerged. This is not to say that Islamic rule would have been a disaster. The Umayyad Caliphate was, in many ways, more advanced than Christian Europe at the time. Islamic scholars preserved ancient Greek and Roman texts that would have been lost otherwise. They made advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Cities like Cordoba and Baghdad were centers of learning when London and Paris were muddy villages. But the fusion of Greco-Roman culture, Christianity, and Germanic traditions that created Western civilization would not have happened. The world would have developed along entirely different lines, and we cannot know what that world would have looked like. Some historians argue that Tours was not as decisive as later chroniclers claimed. They point out that the Umayyad Caliphate was already overstretched, that internal divisions and succession crises would have limited further expansion regardless of what happened in Francia. They note that the battle did not end Islamic raids into Europe, which continued for decades. They suggest that Charles's victory, while important, has been mythologized beyond its actual strategic significance. There is truth to these arguments. The Battle of Tours did not single-handedly save Western civilization. It was one battle in a much larger struggle, but dismissing its importance goes too far in the other direction. Tours was a critical moment because it broke the momentum of Islamic expansion at a time when that momentum seemed unstoppable. It gave Christian Europe time to organize, to consolidate, to build the institutions that would define the medieval period. Without that breathing space, the subsequent development of European civilization would have been impossible. The other argument against the decisive importance of Tours is that the Umayyads were not really trying to conquer Francia, that Abdul Rahman's campaign was just a large raid, not an invasion. But this does not hold up under scrutiny. Abdul Rahman brought his entire field army. He brought his baggage train loaded with supplies for an extended campaign. He was moving slowly and methodically, not racing in and out like a raiding party. His objective was to crush Frankish resistance and establish Umayyad control over Aquitaine, using it as a springboard for future expansion. If it was just a raid, why did he accept battle with Charles instead of avoiding the Frankish army and continuing to plunder? The answer is that he believed he could destroy the Frankish military power in one decisive engagement. He was trying to do to Charles what he had done to Odo at Bordeaux, annihilate the enemy army and eliminate organized resistance. He failed. And that failure had consequences that reverberated for centuries. For the common people of Francia, the victory at Tours meant survival. In the medieval world, When an army conquered your territory, the results were catastrophic. Your crops were burned, your livestock was taken, your home was looted or destroyed. If you were lucky, you were left alive to starve. If you were unlucky, you were killed or enslaved. The Umayyad conquest of Spain had been relatively bloodless in some areas because local leaders surrendered without a fight, but it had been brutal in others. The chronicles describe cities put to the sword, populations massacred or sold into slavery. The same fate awaited Francia if the invasion succeeded. Charles's victory meant that Frankish farmers could plant their crops without fear of Umayyad cavalry burning the fields. It meant that monasteries could continue their work of preserving literacy and learning. It meant that children could grow up speaking their own language, practicing their own religion, living in their own culture. These things seem abstract until you imagine losing them. For the people who lived through it, Tours was not an abstract geopolitical event. It was the difference between life and death, between freedom and slavery. The military lessons of Tours were profound and would shape European warfare for generations. Charles had proven that disciplined infantry, properly positioned and properly led, could defeat cavalry. This was not a new idea. The Greeks had done it at Marathon. The Romans had built an empire on the strength of their legions. But in the chaos of the early medieval period, that knowledge had been lost. European armies had become disorganized mobs, lacking the training and cohesion to stand against coordinated cavalry charges. Charles brought back discipline. He showed that formation mattered more than individual heroism. He demonstrated that patience and defensive strength could overcome speed and mobility. These lessons were not lost. The Frankish armies that fought under Charlemagne would use variations of the shield wall tactic. The English would perfect it at battles like Hastings, and later use the longbow to devastating effect at Crécy and Agincourt. The Swiss pikemen would refine the dense infantry formation into an art form. All of these developments trace their lineage back to the principles Charles demonstrated at Tours. Maintain formation, absorb the enemy's best punch, then counterattack when they are weakened. But perhaps the most important lesson was psychological. Tours proved that faith and fervor do not guarantee victory. The Umayyad soldiers believed they were fighting a holy war, that God had ordained their conquest. They believed that their faith made them invincible. Charles and his men believed in God too, but they also believed in preparation, in tactics, in the unglamorous work of training and drilling and standing in formation until your legs go numb. They believed that God helps those who help themselves. That pragmatic, almost cynical approach to warfare would become a hallmark of European military culture. Europeans would develop a tradition of military professionalism, of treating war as a craft that could be studied and improved. They would build military academies, write treatises on tactics, analyze historical battles for lessons. This tradition would eventually give European armies a technological and organizational edge that would allow them to dominate much of the world in later centuries. And it started with a bastard standing in a muddy field, refusing to run. The religious significance of Tours cannot be ignored. For Christians of the 8th century, the battle was seen as divine intervention. God had sent Charles to stop the Islamic tide, just as he had sent Moses to part the Red Sea. This interpretation was encouraged by the Church, which had good reason to support Charles. The Frankish Church was wealthy and powerful, and it depended on Frankish military protection. If the Umayyads had conquered Francia, the Church would have been destroyed or forced to submit to Islamic rule. The Pope and the bishops showered Charles with praise and gifts. They declared him the defender of the faith. They used the victory at Tours to argue that the Franks were God's chosen people, destined to protect Christianity. This relationship between the Frankish monarchy and the Catholic Church would have enormous consequences. It set the precedent for the alliance between secular rulers and religious authority that would define medieval Europe. It led directly to the coronation of Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor in the year 800, creating the idea of a Christian empire in the West to balance the Islamic Empire in the East. But there is a darker side to this religious triumphalism. The victory at Tours was later used to justify the Crusades, the violent campaigns to reclaim the Holy Land from Islamic rule. If God had helped the Franks stop Islam at Tours, then surely God would help Christian knights retake Jerusalem. The rhetoric of holy war, of defending Christendom against the infidel, became a powerful tool for popes and kings to mobilize armies. The problem with this interpretation is that it reduces a complex military and political conflict to a simple story of good versus evil, Christian versus Muslim. It erases the nuance and complexity of the actual history. The Umayyad Caliphate was not an alien invasion. It was a sophisticated civilization with its own internal politics, its own factions and disputes. Abdul Rahman was not a cartoon villain bent on destroying Christianity. He was a governor trying to expand his territory and increase his power, just like Charles. The soldiers on both sides were not fanatics. They were men fighting for their leaders, their families, their futures. Modern historians try to strip away the religious mythology and look at Tours as a straightforward military engagement. They analyze the tactics, the logistics, the leadership decisions. They compare it to other battles of the period, looking for patterns and lessons. But even the most secular analysis cannot escape the fact that Tours had religious dimensions. The Umayyad expansion was driven in part by Islamic theology, by the concept of jihad, of expanding the domain of Islam. The Frankish resistance was motivated in part by Christian identity, by the desire to protect their churches and their way of life. Religion and politics were inseparable in the medieval world, and any attempt to understand Tours that ignores the religious context is incomplete. What we can say is that Tours was not predetermined by divine will. It was decided by human choices, by Charles's decision to stand and fight, by his tactical genius, by the discipline of his soldiers, by Abdul Rahman's decision to accept battle, by the exhaustion of the Umayyad horses, by the panic that spread. Through the Umayyad camp, all of these factors, human and mundane, combined to produce the outcome. The legacy of Charles Martel extends far beyond the battlefield. He fundamentally changed the political structure of Francia. Before his rise, the kingdom was a loose confederation of competing nobles, each looking out for their own interests. Charles centralized power. He broke the independence of regional aristocrats. He distributed land to his supporters in exchange for military service, creating the foundation of the feudal system that would dominate Europe for centuries. He also reformed the Frankish military. Before Tours, Frankish armies were essentially tribal levies, farmers called up when needed and sent home when the crisis passed. Charles began to professionalize the army. He created a corps of trained, equipped warriors who served him directly. He used church lands to fund this military machine, confiscating monastery estates and giving them to his soldiers. This made him unpopular with some clergy, but it gave him the resources to maintain a standing military force. His reforms were continued and expanded by his descendants, culminating in the professional armies of Charlemagne that would conquer most of Western Europe. But Charles was not a visionary trying to build a new world order. He was a pragmatist trying to survive in a chaotic, violent time. Every decision he made was driven by immediate necessity, by the need to crush the next rebellion, to stop the next invasion, to secure his grip on power. The grand historical consequences of his actions were not part of some master plan. They emerged organically from the choices he made in response to the crises he faced. This is a critical point because it reminds us that history is not shaped by grand designs or inevitable forces. It is shaped by individuals making decisions in moments of uncertainty, often with incomplete information, always with unpredictable consequences. Charles could not have known that his victory at Tours would lead to the Carolingian Empire, to the Holy Roman Empire, to the entire trajectory of European history. He was just trying to win a battle. But in winning that battle, he changed everything. The question of what Charles was thinking during the battle itself is impossible to answer with certainty. We have no first-hand account from him, no diary, no letter, no memoir. What we have are chronicles written decades or centuries later by monks who were not there, who base their accounts on oral traditions and political agendas. These sources tell us what Charles did, but not what he thought or felt. We can speculate, based on his actions and his personality, but it remains speculation. What seems clear is that Charles was not driven by religious fervor. He was not a zealot seeing visions of angels on the battlefield. He was a cold, calculating commander who understood that survival required discipline and patience. He knew that his infantry could not match the Umayyad cavalry in mobility or striking power. His only advantage was defensive strength, the ability to absorb punishment and keep fighting. So he built his entire strategy around that one strength. He turned a disadvantage into an advantage by forcing the enemy to fight on his terms. This ability to assess a situation realistically, to recognize your own limitations and your enemy's weaknesses, to craft a strategy that maximizes your strengths while minimizing your vulnerabilities. This is the mark of military genius. Many commanders throughout history have lost battles because they tried to fight the way they wanted to fight, not the way they needed to fight. They let pride or tradition or honor dictate their tactics. Charles had no such illusions. He fought dirty, he fought smart, he fought to win. And in doing so, he saved a civilization. The contrast between Charles and Abdul Rahman is instructive. Abdul Rahman was a brilliant commander in his own right. He had won many battles. He had conquered Spain. He understood warfare, but he made a crucial mistake at Tours. He underestimated his enemy. He looked at the Frankish army and saw barbarians, unsophisticated warriors who would break at the first charge. He did not adapt his tactics to the reality in front of him. He kept doing what had always worked before, assuming it would work again. When it did not, when the Franks held and held and held, he did not have a backup plan. He just kept throwing his cavalry at the wall, hoping it would eventually crack. Charles, on the other hand, had no preconceptions. He was not bound by tradition or previous success. He looked at the problem in front of him. How do I stop cavalry with infantry? And he solved it. His solution was not elegant. It was brutal and simple, but it worked. This contrast illustrates a fundamental truth about warfare. Flexibility beats rigidity. The commander who can adapt to changing circumstances will defeat the commander who cannot, even if the rigid commander has superior forces. History is full of examples. The Persians at Marathon could not adapt to Greek phalanx tactics. The French at Agincourt could not adapt to English longbows. The Germans in World War I could not adapt to trench warfare. In each case, a powerful army with superior numbers was defeated by an enemy who understood the battlefield better and adapted their tactics accordingly. Charles understood this intuitively. He was not a military theorist. He did not write treatises on warfare, but he had a practical, almost brutal understanding of what worked and what did not. And he was willing to do whatever it took to win. The aftermath of Tours also reveals Charles's political genius. After the battle, he did not declare himself king. He did not demand titles or crowns. He continued to rule through the fiction of the Merovingian monarchy, keeping the puppet king on the throne while wielding all the real power. This was a brilliant move. It allowed him to exercise complete control without triggering a backlash from traditionalist nobles who might have rebelled against a usurper. It gave him legitimacy without the vulnerability that comes with claiming a crown. If things went wrong, he could always blame the king and step back into the shadows. This pragmatic approach to power would be inherited by his descendants, who would eventually discard the pretense and claim the throne outright, but only when the time was right, only when they had built enough support to make the transition smooth. Charles laid the groundwork for that transition by proving that competence mattered more than bloodline, that the man who could defend the kingdom deserved to rule it, regardless of whether he was born to the purple. In the years following Tours, Charles continued to campaign against external and internal threats. He fought the Saxons in the north, the Frisians in the east, rebellious nobles wherever they appeared. He also launched his own raids across the Pyrenees, pushing back against the Umayyad presence in southern Francia. These campaigns were not about conquest. They were about creating a buffer zone, a no-man's land that would make future invasions more difficult. He used the same scorched earth tactics that had proven effective against the Umayyads, burning crops, destroying fortifications, forcing populations to relocate. It was brutal, but it worked. By the time of his death in 741, the borders of Francia were more secure than they had been in generations. The Umayyad threat had been neutralized. The internal rebellions had been crushed. The kingdom was stable. Charles had accomplished what no one thought possible. He had taken a fractured, chaotic realm on the brink of collapse and turned it into the dominant power in Western Europe. His death did not lead to the collapse of his work. He had prepared for succession carefully, dividing his territories between his sons in a way that minimized conflict. His legacy was secure, but more than that, he had changed the trajectory of European history. The Frankish kingdom he saved would evolve into the Carolingian Empire. That empire would become the foundation of France and Germany, the two great powers that would dominate European politics for the next 1,000 years. The military traditions he established would shape European warfare for centuries. The alliance between the Frankish monarchy and the Catholic Church that he cemented would define medieval Christendom. All of this flowed from a single moment in a muddy field between Tours and Poitiers, when a bastard with no right to rule decided to stand and fight. It is a reminder that history turns on small moments, on individual decisions, on the courage or cowardice of single men. Charles Martel was not a saint. He was not a hero in the modern sense. He was a ruthless, pragmatic warrior who seized power through violence and held it through fear. But he was also the man who stood between Christian Europe and Islamic conquest. He was the hammer that stopped the unstoppable. And for that, he earned his place in history. If you visit central France today, there is no grand monument marking the site of the Battle of Tours. Historians are not even completely certain exactly where it happened. The landscape has changed over 13 centuries. Fields have become towns. Rivers have shifted their courses. The bones of the dead have long since turned to dust. But the memory remains. In French history, Charles Martel is remembered as the savior of the nation, the man who proved that France could not be conquered. In European history, he is seen as the defender of Christendom, the warrior who held the line when everything seemed lost. In military history, he is studied as a tactical genius who understood how to turn weakness into strength. All of these interpretations are true, and all are incomplete. Charles was a man of his time, shaped by the brutal realities of 8th century warfare, driven by personal ambition as much as any higher cause. But his personal ambition happened to align with the survival of Western civilization. And that alignment changed the world. The question that haunts historians is what would have happened if Charles had lost. We can never know for certain, but we can make educated guesses based on the trajectory of Umayyad expansion and the weakness of European resistance. The most likely outcome is that Francia would have been gradually absorbed into the Islamic world, not through immediate conquest, but through a slow process of political submission, economic integration, and cultural conversion. Some regions would have resisted longer than others. Some nobles would have converted to Islam to maintain their power. Some populations would have clung to Christianity even under Islamic rule, as they did in Spain. But without a strong Frankish state to provide resistance, without a military force capable of standing against Umayyad armies, the eventual outcome seems clear. And if Francia fell, the domino effect would have been unstoppable. Italy, Germany, even Scandinavia would have been drawn into the Islamic orbit. The entire cultural and political landscape of Europe would have been transformed beyond recognition. This makes Tours one of the most significant battles in human history, not because of the number of casualties, which was probably in the thousands rather than the tens of thousands, not because of revolutionary tactics. The shield wall was hardly a new invention, but because of what was at stake and what the outcome preserved. It was a battle that allowed Western civilization to continue developing along the path it had been following, a path that would lead to universities and cathedrals, to the Renaissance and the Reformation, to the scientific revolution and the age of exploration. None of these developments were inevitable. All depended on the survival of a particular cultural and political framework that was threatened with extinction in 732. Charles Martel, whatever his personal motivations, saved that framework. He gave Europe the time and space it needed to build the institutions and traditions that would define the modern world. For that reason alone, the Battle of Tours deserves its place in the pantheon of decisive battles. But we should also remember the cost. Thousands of men, Frankish and Umayyad, died in that field. They died in terror and agony, far from home, fighting for causes they probably did not fully understand. The Umayyad soldiers were not monsters. They were men serving their commanders, believing they were spreading the true faith, hoping to return home with plunder and glory. The Frankish soldiers were not heroes in shining armor. They were terrified farmers and minor nobles, conscripted into an army, forced to stand in a line and face death because their lord commanded it. Both sides believed God was on their side. Both sides thought they were fighting for righteousness. Both were wrong and both were right. War is never as simple as the stories we tell about it. The reality is always more complicated, more painful, more ambiguous. But sometimes, rarely, a battle has consequences that transcend the immediate suffering. Tours was one of those battles. It was a hinge point in history, a moment when the future hung in the balance. And on October 10th, 732, in a field somewhere in central France, the balance tipped. A wall of Frankish shields held. An empire's advance was stopped, and the course of Western history was preserved.